Um, Today, so for those of you who don't know, particularly there's a few people I think here for the first time, so you're very welcome. This is hosted by St. Peter's, Surrey Hills. We are doing Evangelium every Sunday and continue to push through doing our Evangeliums despite the lockdown. And moving on to Zoom has actually been really beneficial for us. We've been able to expand our audience. We've been able to have people tuning in from all around the country, and it's been really, really good for us as a parish to bond. So you're all very, very welcome. Today, of course, is Father's Day. And we really wanted to have a talk on the importance of fatherhood. There are two different types of fatherhood. There's the physical fatherhood and spiritual fatherhood. And in a few weeks' time, we're actually going to get our beloved parish priest, Father John, to talk about the importance of the priesthood and the role of the priest. But today, we thought for our Father's Day, we'll invite one of our newest dads in the parish, Isaac. Now, Isaac, those of you who don't know him, he came from England to the sunny shores of Australia and thought, oh, wow, what's this? What's that golden thing in the sky that I've never seen before? And came to Australia to marry Mary. And since their marriage in 2019, they have had the birth of Robbie, who you may have seen earlier, and they've got a second one on the way. And Isaac will be able to fill you in on when that one is due. Actually, Amy, you might be able to tell me because I can't remember off the top of my head. But yeah, we've got another baby on the way. So Isaac, when I asked him to do the talk, he said, I reflect on fatherhood all the time. I'd love to. So we're very excited to hear Isaac's reflections on the importance of fatherhood in a fatherless society and some of his reflections upon those. So we're really, really excited to hand over to Isaac. Isaac, on you. And I can ask everyone, please, just to mute, just to make sure you're muted, just so we don't have any unwanted interruptions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Colin. Now, I hope everyone can hear me okay. I've been getting a little bit of tech lag, but everyone can hear me good. That's great. Now, I'm not quite sure how to share my screen. I do feel like a dad at a bit of a technology old fogey. So I might need a bit of a hand with just how to my screen, if that's all right, Colin. So, Colin, you're still on mute.
No, I just had my own dad moment. Hold on, Dad. There should be a green button down the bottom of your screen that says share screen.
Lovely, I've got it now. Thank you.
Easy.
Great. Okay. Okay, now wonderful. Okay, that is totally the wrong slide. Give me a second. Okay, wonderful. There we go. Well, thanks. So yeah, as Colin said, if anyone doesn't know me, my name is Isaac. I've been a parishioner at St. Peter's for a few years now, and I have two children. I've got my little boy Robert, and I've got another unborn child on the way, due to be born at Christmas. So I've only been a father for a fairly little while now, and I really do bow to the wisdom and experience of everyone else at St. Peter's who's had children for quite a bit longer. If there's any questions from any of them, I look forward to hearing them at the end. Today I want to look at the importance of physical fatherhood, and I'll be covering a few sort of main points. Firstly, what it is that makes fatherhood distinct from other relationships we have in the world, how modern society fails us when it comes to fatherhood, how fathers reflect God, different stages of fatherhood, and then just a few concluding thoughts. But first, I want to, make the point. As Colin said, today I'm talking on physical fatherhood, and Father John will be talking later on spiritual fatherhood in a few weeks, I think. But I want to make the point that physical fatherhood is also spiritual fatherhood, because I think throughout Catholic thought, the physical and the spiritual are intertwined. So if we look at the work of social action, for example, we don't just preach the gospel to the poor and then leave them starving. But then we also don't just, give bread and soup to the hungry, but fail to feed them with the gospel, because that's not true charity. So constantly think throughout Catholic thought, you see, sure, you might be a physical father, but you're also a spiritual father. And I think Father John may also talk about how spiritual fathers are physical fathers in a certain way. Leading on from that, what is the ultimate purpose of fatherhood? I would say it is to populate heaven with new saints. That's not my phrase, but I can't remember where I first heard it. I originally thought that was a phrase that was used in the prayers of our nuptial mass. But I was having a look back through the other day, and I couldn't seem to find that particular phrase. But time and time again throughout the wedding mass, when you're taking your vows, when the priest is giving a blessing, when he's doing the Eucharistic prayer, there are numerous references to children. But it's not just, are you okay to have children? It's constantly, are you okay to have children and then raise them in the Catholic faith? So one of I think the three vows that Mary and I said, I am to, was, are you prepared to accept children from God and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and his church? That was one of only three things that we actually said, yes, I am prepared to do this for. So what does this actually look in practice, children in Christ's law and church? Get to that in a moment, but first I want to focus on some of the more worldly aspects of fatherhood, and then we'll see how you can always look at the worldly aspect of fatherhood and extrapolate from that and bring out the spiritual aspect. Now, what makes fatherhood distinct from other relationships that we might have? The first, I think, and most obvious one is that it is, generally speaking, biological. Obviously, you do also have adoptive fathers, but broadly speaking, you're almost always talking about children who are your own biological offspring. And one of the things I was really struck by last week for James's Evangelium is how when you do have an adoptive relationship, and I think adoptive fathers are wonderful and do great things, but there is always that, I suppose, that hurdle to overcome, which is that there is the longing for the sort of biological connection. And James talked about how that was a big sort of hole in his life that he was struggling to fill. Now, on this next slide, there's a couple of things. But this photo in the middle is one that I sort of stumbled across a couple of years back. And it may not mean that much to you other than some people with radical hair and some old-fashioned clothes. But this is actually a photo of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, William Spencer, in the chair. And then standing by him are my great-great-great-grandfather, so his son, John Spencer, and another great-great-great-great-uncle. Now, the thing that strikes me about this is that, so this is taken back in the 1800s sometime, right? That man in the chair looks so much like my dad. He's got more hair. I have to put that in, but it's a striking resemblance. It looks like my dad's put a strange wig on and posted a weird photo. Even though that photo is like getting on for 200 years old now, and generations going back. And also like the two men standing by there, they look like if you took my dad's brothers, my 5 uncles, and you sort of smushed them together and like created two composite versions. That's how they look. And so just sort of seeing that, like, I think we sometimes get used to seeing like relationships and fathers and parents and ancestors in films where obviously it's different actors playing different people, unless you're watching Back to the Future where like all the ancient ancestors are the exact same. But it is curious how like that sheer physical resemblance goes back such a long way. The other thing that's on this screen is just genealogy and family trees are a bit of a hobby of mine. And so you can literally just sort of see on either side. That's the thing that I always go to first, if I got to admit, is the paternal line. So I look back and go, okay, my dad's Patrick, his dad was Michael, and then I can just sort of go back and back and back, generation to generation. And I don't know if it's just me, but that is sort of the thing that I immediately fixate on, was like, well, how far back can I find the male Spencer line when I'm looking into family trees? By a strange coincidence, the very first one I could find was a Robert Spencer. So we now have 2 Robert Spencers in my family tree. Now I like that. I think that's just like a bit of a fairly useless hobby of mine that I enjoy. But of course, in the real world, we have seen more, I think, in history, how this idea about my family, and particularly the sort of the male line, this is almost like a form of immortality for the person involved. So, you know, at the history altering level, we have, you know, sort of kings, and, you know, the king's eldest son will become another king, and so on and so on and so on. But I think there has been through a lot of history this idea that basically, okay, look, I'm going to age and wither and die. What's my version of immortality? And it's basically, well, my family will continue, my family line, my family name, and, you know, in 500 years there'll still be descendants with my name with a similar face to me. So that's, I suppose, a large way of saying fatherhood is generally biological. The second thing would be that it is an unequal relationship, sort of by definition. It's a relationship where you have a sort of a superior and an inferior, not morally speaking, but similar to, like, I don't know, if you have a teacher and a student, it's not a relationship between two equals like friends. It is of you know, one looking down upon the other in a certain sense. Now, all this applies to being a mum as well, I suppose. So what is it that makes fatherhood distinct from motherhood in this case? Well, the fatherhood, firstly, is the head of the household. He's the domestic authority, and as such, he's going to be the first authority in any child's life. Now, obviously, mum also has authority, but when you talk about the family bubble, you know, the father is like the first ultimate authority, I suppose, that a child encounters. The father is also, generally speaking, the breadwinner. Now, I want to be clear at this point. I'm painting in broad brushstrokes. I'm not saying if you've got a, you know, family where some of these are not the case, that it's a bad family. But broad brushstrokes apply. The father will be the one who is with the main obligation to provide materially for the family. And so, like, in a certain sense, like, just do what you're told. But also, like, yeah, it is literally the father's house most of the time. It's the parents' co-owned house, but when you look into most families, it'll be the dad who put up the bulk of the cash for the house. All this sort of combines to mean that I think one of the main differences between dad and mum is that the father essentially has to do more with less time, if you look at it, by the very nature of his role. So if you look at your average dad, if you're lucky, he's going to be out of the house, you'd say, or 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. if he's got a, you know, a job with nice hours and a reasonable commute. And that's 5 days of the week, almost every single week. That's the physical side. Now, what does this mean spiritually? Well, just as I said that dad is the head of the household in, you know, other matters, he's got to be the head of the household spiritually. And now I think it's actually become slightly more acute, at least for us, you know, starting our family during lockdown. So, you know, we have this obligation that can never go away to keep the Sabbath day holy, but you can't go to mass. And of course, the obligation to go to mass has been lifted for now. So what we've sort of been getting in the habit of doing during these COVID times is, you know, as well as the ability to live stream mass, we've been doing like our own little liturgy, doing the divine office. Now, again, you know, when you're doing something at home, you need someone to essentially lead it. And that's, you know, what I've been doing in leading us, saying morning prayer, evening prayer, and night prayer. It's also the, I think it's fair to say that shouldn't just be a COVID, you know, Sunday's a bit unusual thing. Like, outside of COVID times, it should be a father's duty to lead his family in communal prayer. But I think it's also the father's role to provide for the family spiritually more broadly. You know, not just to sort of rock up and say, oh, we're saying prayers, excellent, I shall be in charge. That's not the point. It's to make sure that he takes an active interest in making sure and promoting the family's spiritual life. So that could take a number of different forms, right? That could be praying the rosary regularly. That could be getting to daily mass and adoration when, you know, in normal times. But I think it's the father's role, just as it's the father's role to make sure that there's, you know, bread put on the table. It should be his role to make sure that the family is sustained spiritually as well as physically. Now, there is a whole way that, of course, the mother's not just a bystander here. She plays a massive role in here, but that's maybe a talk for someone who's more qualified to talk about motherhood than just my vague observations of trying to work out what all the many things that Mary actually does. Now, talking about this sort of spiritual aspect, my old parish priest used to tell a story of when he was a younger priest and he walked into a church in Liverpool. This is back in the day when churches were generally sort of unlocked during most of the daylight hours. And he saw a young father who was just walking his little boy around the church, The little boy would be about 3 or 4. And he was showing them the Stations of the Cross and clearly sort of explaining each station of the cross to the little boy. Now, my parish priest he would touch on this example a lot, and he would always say, no one else in the world could do the job that Father was doing. Like I couldn't do it, you couldn't do that job. The Pope himself in Rome couldn't do the job that Father was doing. And I think that's very true. Now, as I said, all of this is across the backdrop that a father doesn't do this. The father doesn't become a good father simply by being around all the time. A father has to work to put food on the table, as I've said, and that's a sort of normal, sensible, healthy thing. So like, I don't think you become twice as good a father just by being around twice as much. Otherwise, we should all sort of aspire to be unemployed and there constantly. Now, I do appreciate I've said a couple of times that talking about the headship of the father. And I know that can maybe be slightly confronting language and maybe even controversial today. But I think it's also a very important thing. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about, the father dominating the mother in some way or treating her as if she's one of the children, because that's not what it means. But I think what I mean is one of the more destructive modern ideas I think we have is this notion, and I've heard it from some people, which is, although not in the parish, let's say, which is like, I'm going to be just like a friend to my children. I had this bad relationship with my children, and I'm going to be a great parent because I'm going to be my kid's best friend. But that's not what you're there for. Like, obviously you should, you want to have a loving, healthy, happy relationship with your children, but your kids are going to have friends, right? And if you're trying to be your kid's best friend, that's not what they need you to be. If you do that, you're depriving them of having, a mum and a dad who actually act like it. And I think in this modern age, I don't want to be too doom and gloom, but I think we're a little bit in danger of having, a generation of children who've basically been raised by people who are themselves children, spiritually and emotionally. And I don't think that's a very healthy dynamic to have. And this brings me on, I suppose, to how society fails us. Now, I think the nuclear family, which is mum and dad who are married and living exclusively to each other, and they're welcoming children sort of joyfully into their lives. That's the bedrock in so many ways of a healthy society. Now, how does today's society fail us? I mean, in a number of ways, but on this topic specifically, we can look at the breakdown of marriage, particularly over the last 60 years. And we say, okay, one of the most obvious knock-on effects of that is that so many of us in today's society have grown up with one parent. And not always, but it's normally the dad who's missing out of the equation. Now that could be because the parents are divorced. Could be because the parents never got married in the first place. It's not just that marriage breaks down, it's also that we've created a society that says marriage isn't that important to get into in the first place. Even when you have situations where both parents really do try their best to be active and involved, which is incredibly commendable, you still got the situation where you sort of have it's almost like you have two single parents rather than a married parent unit. Now, as I said, 60 years, that's sort of 2, 3, maybe even 4 generations now of, men who've grown up without a father, without that strong primary male role model in their lives. And it's also women who've grown up without, that basic primary male relationship in their lives. And that has, I think, very unhealthy knock-on consequences and effects. But it's not just single parents, though, in society who are doing it tough. Because even when your parents are married, I think a lot of us in society suffer from what I call, but I haven't invented this term, it's the Homer Simpson effect. Here he is, the lovable goofball. So you probably all know the basic setup of The Simpsons, right? But you've got Homer Simpson, who's a sort of bumbling, idiotic, goofy dad. You've got Marge, who's the practical, world-weary mum. You've got Lisa, who's the sort of very intelligent, precocious, sensitive daughter. Then you've got Bart, who's the very sort of badly behaved, rebellious, troublemaker boy. And then you've got Maggie, who's the baby. And that's, she's got maybe more character than that, but for this purpose, she's basically just the baby. Now, I think you can see from the way I've phrased that, that's not an enormously positive view of fatherhood. Because, look, Homer can be, lovable and very funny, and he's certainly iconic. but I think it's struggle to say that he's a good father. Like, he's maybe not like Family Guy level bad, but I don't think he's a great dad. He's not a leader in any particular way, and he doesn't seem to, at least in most episodes, he's not someone who takes a particularly active interest in his children or sort of inspires them to greater depths of, intensity or achievement, or let alone sort of holiness. I mean, I guess if we're taking Homer's example of a spiritual dad, I always remember that line, which is, why do I have to go to church? Why can't I just worship God in my own way by praying like mad on my deathbed? Now, I think also when you combine this with the way that Bart is portrayed, you do have a fairly sort of negative set of stereotypes for both men and boys. So you can be the troublemaker kid, or you can be the sort of slightly overwhelmed, lost deadbeat dad. Now, look, The Simpsons is just one TV show, so it's not a big deal, and I'm not trying to say that we should cancel The Simpsons or anything like that. But I think the problem more is broader, which is that The Simpsons, in so many ways, being such an iconic show as well, has, I think, become the default template for any family sitcom. And to be honest, much of how the media will portray any sort of mum-dad relationship, even if you just, find a random commercial with a male-female couple. I think we in the media have become so sort of focused about, we've got to steer away from this damsel in distress, ditzy dame type stereotype, that there's almost an obligation to portray women throughout media as, tough and confident and smart. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because those are all things that women should indeed aspire to be. But the problem is that it often means that men, and in this context, particularly dads, they end up becoming by default the fool guy, the butt of the joke, the person who's there to be goofy and foolish, because normally, you're not going to have a very compelling sitcom if everyone is tough and confident and smart and doesn't make mistakes. So you need someone to have, and if it can't be the mum character and it can't be the daughter character, it's going to end up being the dad and the son. Now, again, like I said, look, I don't think we need to be overly sort of, po-faced in cancel culture like this. By all means, watch The Simpsons and enjoy it. And I think also, it is fine, it's good and okay for men to be goofy and funny and silly at times. And likewise, don't think any of us want women to be wilting flowers who, can't survive 5 minutes without a strong man coming and saving their life. That's not good and healthy either. But all of this sort of way of portraying fathers is different and extraneous to what fatherhood at its very core should be. And this is where maybe a slightly more controversial one, but what I want to spend the next few minutes talking about, which is that fatherhood should be a reflection of our relationship with God. Now, a quick disclaimer before I get into this. I don't want you to think that I have this massively inflated ego, right? I'm not trying to say that because I'm a dad, I've become like God. I'm not saying you should treat your fathers as if they are divine beings, because, look, dads are human beings like everyone else, and idolatry is a very bad thing. But one of the most radical teachings of all of Jesus' radical teachings is that we can call God our Father. Again, my old parish priest, he used to say that he would, try and meditate for a time on the Our Father prayer, and sort of really, rather than just praying, go really deep into all the words and pick out all the meanings. And he said he can never get past the first two words, the richness and depth of God is our Father, and what an intensely Christian way that is of viewing God. It's very different to other faiths. Now, we in fact, we go further. We say that the Trinitarian God exists primarily in relationship to himself as Father, Son, and the love that exists between them. So what implications does this have for how we should view our earthly fathers if we say that God is our heavenly Father? Well, the sort of 19th, 20th century psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, he had a less than positive view, it's fair to say, of God and religion in general. And in part, it was because of this issue. Now, Freud was raised Jewish. He became strongly atheistic later. But he argued that God was an illusion based on sort of an infant's need for a powerful father figure. So basically, Freud says we take that sort of child's need for protection and authority and power, and we sort of extrapolate it outwards, and we just impose it. We impose like a feeling of security on like a terrifying, horrible universe. That's a kind of simplified version of what Freud would have said. But look, I don't think you need to agree with Freud on religion or on most other things. But like, I think you can ignore most of the psychobabble and say, yeah, there's a grain of truth in this. I think it's just that Freud has the whole situation precisely backwards, right? So God exists. We start with that premise. Now, I think one of the more fundamental Catholic beliefs is that everything that exists in this world that is not God was created by God. And therefore, because it's created by God, in some way it is revealing of God. In some way it's a reflection of an aspect of God. So let's say, for example, we take a tiger. Okay, you look at like a tiger in mid-leap. Now, in that tiger, you can see, the beauty of, particularly of like the fur coat and like the mixture of the colors and the stripes. You can see the sort of aesthetic gracefulness, and that's an interesting word. It is graceful, full of grace. The aesthetic gracefulness as it moves. You can also see in a tiger something that's very sort of wild and savage and terrifying. All of these things, in some way, reflect some aspect of God's nature. So where am I going with this? I think we can say the exact same thing when it comes to fathers. If we say that God is Father, then a father is called to authentically imitate this aspect of the divine life. So to be a father to our children, those children are also God's children. We are put in a parental role by God the Father. Now, what does this mean for me as a dad? And what does it mean for children? Because some of us are fathers, all of us are children of a father. Well, to answer that, I think we need to separate fatherhood out into a few different stages. So, different stages of fatherhood. I think we can divide fatherhood up into either 3 or 6 distinct stages, depending on exactly how you look at it. So there is fatherhood as it relates to a young child. That's like a newborn or an infant or like a very small kid. Then there's being a father to an adult. That relationship should, if it's healthy, be very, very different to your relationship with a small child. And then, of course, there's the stage between that, by definition. Generally, sort of, the awkward teenage years. That's the sort of transition from child into adult. And stereotypically, that's where things tend to get very difficult. But then I also think that being a dad to a son and a dad to a daughter are quite different things in themselves. So that can basically double everything. So depending on how you look at it, you can say that there are 3 stages or there are 6 stages. So I would happily say that I have recently started the first 6th of being a dad. And I look forward to actually, finding out how the rest of it goes. But one way the Bible has been described, admittedly among many, is as God's relationship with his children, changing and maturing and developing from infancy into something more sort of approaching adulthood. Now, you can probably take that too far, but I think there's at least an element of truth in it. And so if you think about when you're parenting a young child, it is often very directive. There is an awful lot of laying down the law. This thing is good for you, do it. This thing is bad for you, don't do that. You do that dozens of times a day. Now, to our modern mindsets, that can seem quite oppressive. Like, I don't want to have rules, don't tell me what to do. And so I think even your average Catholic would look at Leviticus and sort of go, not quite sure what's going on there. Maybe let's skip over that bit and get to the Gospels. They're nice. But to a small child, this isn't, having rules is not oppressive. We need rules, we need structure, because when you have the right structure, that's what gives you authentic freedom. It's not just freedom to do whatever you want. Now, of course, you can easily go too far. Indeed, with small kids, if you have rules for the sake of rules and not rules for the sake of the child, of course you get into a muddle. And no child would like that. Like, if I try, actually trying to make my child never walk on the cracks in the pavement, for example, and then 50,000 other rules, he's just going to decide all rules are stupid. But let's imagine, and I appreciate, I think we have a lack of sports fans in this group perhaps, but imagine you're trying to teach a child to play a sport. So the example I would pick would be rugby, right? And at first the child might not get it. Like, why does rugby have all these rules? Like, why can't I just pass the ball forward? It's easier. Why can't I just go into a ruck and grab the ball with my hands and all that stuff? Why can't I just run past the offside line? But if you didn't have those rules, the game would be just a massive chaotic mess. And just no one would enjoy it. It'd be a scramble. In my notes, I've got a harsh shape at the Wallabies, but I'll do that. But I think you need to have the rules for the game to work. I think anyone who's watched a game, like, you have a game, right, and it's like the whistle gets blown every 50 seconds. So every 5 seconds or so, it's like, that's offside, that's a penalty, that's a knock on, and it's just a really boring game, right? You can have too many rules. At the same time, without the rules, the whole thing just breaks down. And for a small child, it's like that. You have to have the rules first, and then you internalize those rules. So that's the thing. I think the goal of parenting a young child shouldn't be just to form someone who is really good at following rules. Because, like, okay, great, you turn 18 and you can do what people tell you. That's not quite the goal in life. And it's not just impose your will upon your children. But I think the goal of having a young child, the point of all these rules, is to form your child into a certain type of person, and that would be the virtuous man or the virtuous woman. And this is why, as much as we sort of talk about rules, everything has to be contained with and underpinned by love. And I think the most obvious form of love in a family is demonstrated affection. It's one thing to say, like, I love my children, but how often do you tell them? How often do you demonstrate that? And that's the thing I think we can sometimes lose sight of in the Old Testament. We see all these rules and all these commandments and instructions and sort of various what looks like sort of nitpicky stuff that they can and can't do. It's all surrounded and contained in numerous examples and stories and reinforcements of how much God loves his people Israel. Now, but then things change as your child grows up. When your child is a grown adult, you don't just order them around as a parent. You don't call up your 30-year-old son and say, son, I want you to do this, and you're going to do it. Because someone will say, well, no, go away. I'm an adult. Leave me alone. Now, hopefully your son will have more respect for you as a father. But like you can't just command them to do things. You don't say, this is the rule and you're going to follow it when they're a grown adult. The point is that your children, by the time they reach adulthood, should have internalized the moral life so that they can basically parent themselves. And that's what we see, I think, in the transition to the New Testament. All the laws and rules and commandments ultimately boil down into one commandment in two parts, which is you've got to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul, and you have to love your neighbor as yourself. All the rest is just sort of is commentary. Like it's not wrong, it's true and accurate, but it flows from that one simple rule. Likewise, you have a small child, don't pull mummy's hair. That's a big one here at the moment. Don't climb on the table. Don't throw things at daddy from close range. Don't do this, don't do that. The broad point is be a virtuous, in my case, my son, become a virtuous man. Become the sort of person who wants to be good. Now, so like right now, I do tend to spend some time, I think Colin said, just looking at Robert and reflecting on things. And I also, every day, I can't help but think, like, how must we look to God? How must God look at us and perceive us? Because, like, in so many ways, we are so sort of small and helpless and, falling over and getting into issues. So even little things like, so right, Robbie will be happy and he'll wander off and merrily play by himself for a bit. Then the moment he falls over, or the moment he drops something in his hand or something, it's like the whole world has fallen apart, and there'll be floods of tears, and he'll come and all he'll want will be mummy or daddy. And I think to us, we're a lot like that to God. I think we often live our lives it's like, I'm doing great, either I don't need God, or like, yeah, sure, I've got God. He's in this nice little compartment. I'll go to church on Sunday, and then you lose your job, or a loved one dies, or some other sort of big calamity that's a massive calamity to us, not necessarily so much in the divine plan. And then it's like everything's awful, and like I'm going to go to church, I'm going to spend an hour in adoration, I'm going to bow for the tabernacle. It's like, please God, please, why? because a lot of it is our relationship to God. Another little example is literally just this morning, right? So I took Robbie to the park, the playground, and he loves it, and he would go on the swings and go down the slide, and this little wheel who just sort of turn back and forward for about 5 minutes, and then it comes time to leave. Okay, Robbie, we're going to go pick up, and it's like the world has ended. So he's red in the face, and it's almost like cartoonish, like little tears that won't roll down his cheeks. They'll spring forward because he's crying so hard that they literally bounce out and splash in the face. And then he's in the pram. He's really hating it, not happy about it. 30 seconds later, we're on the way home. He's happy. He's over it. He's forgotten about it, and he's turned around. And I honestly think that we can just see so much, especially in small children, and be like, wow, like this is like a tiny fraction of what the gap between God and man must be like. And so I think whenever we have, maybe like a crisis of faith, or how could this awful thing happen, I always just sort of think of like little Robbie going, I fell over and the world has ended, and how could this happen? Or, Dad is taking me away from the playground. This is the worst thing ever. How could this be allowed to happen? And I think that's maybe a sign, an encouragement for us to hold on to faith. Now, look, I'm talking about the transition from small children to adult children. Do you become obsolete as a dad when your children turn 21? No, I mean, of course not. I do think in society more broadly, and I'm probably not a very good example of this, but we should try and reclaim the idea of being respectful to one's elders. Not blindly obeying them. That's not how adult life goes. We should learn from people's life experience and hopefully from their wisdom. And of course, even when you become an adult, you don't sort of throw off all the structures of authority and I answer to no man. Part of the Catholic spirituality, in fact, is that idea that everyone should practice obedience. Everyone should have some superior over them. So it's not just I'm going to do whatever the heck I want with my will. Now, all that sort of said about like the difference between small children to older children, I think it's worth saying a couple of things on how I think fathering a son and fathering a daughter, even though they've only actually got a very small amount of experience of one and none of the other, I think they're quite different things. So if you think about when you're fathering a son, you are basically you're being a direct role model for that child, right? In fact, you are the primary role model for him in his life. You're almost like a template for him. In my experience, and some of the fellows here may disagree, in my experience, men tend to have a fairly broad view of their own father. It tends to be either you say, oh, I want to be like my dad, or you say, yeah, I don't really want to be like my dad. And that's, you're one or the other. You kind of fall into one of the two camps, I think, most of the time. Even now, actually, I see little things like how Robert will copy me. So this is a little while ago, but I remember it was early morning. I woke up early for whatever reason, so I started reading a book because I'm lying there reading a book. And Robbie woke up and he saw it was hilarious, so he hit me. He grabbed the book and he was holding it sort of upside down and reading it sort of out loud and laughing out loud because he thought it's hilarious. So it's that thing, like children do like copying their parents in so many ways. Whereas I think, no, look, I'm sure baby girls also copy their parents. But I think when they get older, women tend, in my experience, to have a slightly more nuanced view of their mothers. It's like, there are these 47 aspects of my mother that I want to emulate, and like these 14 that I think need alteration or that sort of thing. But I think, again, as a man, I think it tends to be A or B. Like my dad, not like my dad. And then I think when you're fathering a daughter, again, speaking from the abstract rather than experience, you're not a direct role model in the same way. Like you should be a role model in many, many ways. But rather you're more like the primary male relationship in her life. You are the person from whom she's going to firstly learn how to relate to men and how men will relate to her. Like, again, you don't need to get into Freudian psychobabble or anything to agree, like this is going to inform her future relationships, be that romantic relationships, be those friendships, be that any other male-female relationship. If you start off with a healthy and wholesome father-daughter relationship, that means that she learns to respect herself, but to expect respect from others, how men look at women, all that sort of thing, like having an actual healthy male-female relationship rather than a slightly sort of toxic one when she grows up. Now, there's some of my concluding thoughts. I should probably say at this point, because I don't think I've said it yet, fatherhood is an absolute privilege. Like, it really is thoroughly fulfilling and thoroughly enjoyable. But it is also hard work. Now, there's a modern mindset out there that I've heard. I think particularly when we were sort of expecting Robbie's birth. Firstly, the number of people who said to me like, "Oh, enjoy getting sleep now while you can because you'll never sleep again," wasn't entirely helpful. But that's sort of advice you get given a lot. If anyone's concerned, like, it doesn't really affect your sleep that much. I think it's worse if you're a mother, I think. But I think I have the ability to sleep through a lot of things. But there's a modern mindset out there that sort of says, look, parenting is hard work, but it's all worth it, when you see them smile or you look at their beautiful face. Yeah, sure. I think we should be a little bit more Franciscan in our mindsets when it comes to looking after, and I'm talking, I guess, about small children particularly here. Because look, all that hard work is absolutely worth it, but I think it's worth it on its own terms. It's like, when if Robbie's having a bad night, right, and he wakes up at 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. and 5 a.m., or like he's got a really bad few days of nappies, like, that's all worth it on its own terms. Because fatherhood is, or parenthood in general, is a brilliant God-given way to practice the works of mercy. Let me just read out the corporal and spiritual works of mercy and think about these in a parenthood context, right? Feed the hungry. I feed the hungry every day. Give drink to the thirsty. Clothe the naked, which can be hard when he's running around out having a bath. Give shelter to travelers. He's not really a traveler, but literally giving shelter every single day. Visit the sick. Visit the imprisoned. Bury the dead. Obviously, I mean, with lockdown, we're all imprisoned and we're not allowed to visit each other, which makes it harder. But like, you don't really want to be. Look, I think one of the hardest things you'd ever have to do in life would be to bury a child. But it wasn't that long ago. It was a fairly regular part of being parenthood that you'd have very high child mortality rates, and so it was an unpleasant fact of life that, I talk about family trees, right? I remember looking like some branch of the family where it's like, did they really have 14 kids? And then you sort of worked out that, oh, like, gosh, there were 3 born this year and they all died within the same year, and you sort of realized that actually times were harsher back then. But even in a more modern context, like, I don't think I know a married woman who's had like a family of children and hasn't also had at least one miscarriage, and only a few. And now, Mary and I have been very blessed so far. We've not had to confront that, but it's a part of being a married couple that almost certainly happens at some point, and that's going to be like that's not one of the joys of parenthood I'm looking forward to. I put it that way. Now let's look at the spiritual works of mercy. To instruct the ignorant, to counsel the doubtful, to admonish the sinner, to bear wrongs patiently, to forgive offences willingly, to comfort the afflicted, and to pray for the living and the dead. Just as you should be practicing the corporal works of mercy for your children, you should be practicing the 7 spiritual works of mercy for your children as well. It is a work of mercy to raise your children in the Catholic faith, to listen to and handle their doubts, to don't just tell children off all the time, but like to tell them when they're wrong and what's right, and to correct them in the faith, and all those things. And so I think we talk about like what makes parenthood worth it. When you get a smile, or like you go, oh, isn't my child beautiful today, or all the little heartwarming moments that, to be honest, happen like every 10 minutes or so. Those aren't the things that make parenthood worthwhile. Like, parenthood is worthwhile on its own. But I think those little things, it's just God's grace pouring forth in abundance. And that's pretty much it, I think, for me. I hope we fit within the time okay. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you very